the Nashville area's BPAC meeting. Appreciate everyone getting on the line today. So first we'll have William Brewer from TDOT give us a rundown of his work on some story maps having to do with pedestrian safety. And then we'll hand it off to Dr. Chris Cherry from University of Tennessee-Knoxville, and he'll give a quick rundown of his research at UT having to do with pedestrian safety. As you probably know, October is Pedestrian Safety Month, so that's one of the big reasons why we're hosting this meeting. And then after their presentation, we'll have a little time for discussion, and then Nora Kern from Walk Bike Nashville will give some updates of the work that Walk Bike is doing in relation to pedestrian safety. So I'd like to start just with a question. So I'm the active transportation planner for the Nashville region. We reconvened our BPAC after about 5 years for our regional transportation plan update, and have been focusing our pedestrian safety work on how to improve projects in our regional transportation plans in terms of pedestrian safety. So I'd like to ask the coordinators of each of the BPACs. I believe Knoxville, Memphis, and Chattanooga have joined us today, but if there are any others, feel free to speak up. So if you could just introduce yourself and answer the question, do you have any current pedestrian safety initiatives in your BPAC, and really any pedestrian safety related work that you guys are working on?
Hi, this is Brian Hill from Bike Walk Knoxville. Here, I guess we don't really have a BPAC, but this is our sort of stand-in. We're working on a Vision Zero Knoxville campaign here. I suppose that's not a necessarily specific initiative, but it is one that certainly captures and focuses on where fatalities and serious injuries are occurring most, and that is inordinately among bicyclists and pedestrians. So a lot of the tools and strategies we're going to be developing as part of that program will certainly lend themselves to that.
Great, thank you, Brian.
This is Courtney Geary from the Chattanooga TPO, and we have a multimodal advisory committee that's our equivalent of the BPAC, and have several members that have joined us today. For our 2045 regional transportation plan, we did a crash data analysis, including a network screening that identified some corridors and intersections that were the worst performing for bicyclists and pedestrians in terms of safety, and have worked that into our project evaluation for our regional transportation to try to elevate and prioritize those projects. As well as a secondary measure that looked at crash reduction, looking at crash modification factors in terms of how could a project help to reduce crashes, and then comparing that to the crash history of the corridor to come up with an estimate of the number of crashes that a project might be able to reduce. Jonathan Gibbons, who's our multimodal transportation planner, is also on the call. He's looked at assigning bicycle and pedestrian crash factors to that data to start giving us a better sense of why the crashes might be occurring. And we're hoping to see what kind of results that we get out of that data, so that we can better hone in on the types of safety improvements that would need to be implemented to address those issues. Thanks so much.
This is William Anderson with the Mount Juliet BPAC. We currently do not have a pedestrian safety initiatives. We've used police analysis of studies of crash for pedestrian and bicycle related accidents for submitting of our grants. We did a year-long study with a organization out of North Carolina that was rejected by the city that would have been implemented many safety factors We've participated in an ADA analysis of our infrastructure and are currently working on improvements in that area.
All right, thank you all. Is there anyone else, maybe someone from Memphis that's on the call that wants to introduce themselves? All right, sounds good. I'll move on. So these are just some questions just to have a good representation of who we know is on the call. So if you could just go to this website real quick on your phone or whatever device you have and answer this question real quick, and I'll post the next slide, the live results to see who from each area has attended the call. I'll give you guys about 10 more seconds to answer.
Hi, this is Caroline Cooley from Knoxville. I haven't figured out how to click.
No worries. All right, so hopefully everyone has had a chance to answer. I'll move on to the next question and then we'll get into the presentations. So it looks like we've got some people from Chattanooga, a little less from Knoxville, and lots from Nashville, and a few others. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the 6 E's of active transportation. But this question is basically, which one do you feel you best fit into? So the same deal, just go to this website and type in which answer you think best represents you. All right, it looks like everyone's answered. So most people fit into the engineering column, some from equity, some from enforcement, and then education evaluation. Oh, there's another for education. So looks like we've got some engineers, some planners, some advocates, law enforcement. Awesome. All right. So I'm going to hand it over to William Brewer from TDOT. And William, I will stop sharing my screen so you can go ahead and take it away.
Great, thanks, Dan. Oh, sorry, I was just about to say thanks, Daniel. And I was going to let Rochelle, our active transportation coordinator, go ahead and give us an intro while I'm pulling this up.
Yeah, thanks, William, and hi, everybody. So William is going to be walking us through a couple tools that TDOT has developed and is developing to analyze pedestrian safety factors. The first one, I know some of you know about this one. It's called the Pedestrian, well, the what is it, Multimodal Prioritization Index, and we are using that tool in particular to evaluate and select projects for our Pedestrian Road Safety Initiative, which basically at a high level is our corridors and intersections in Tennessee that have the highest crash numbers on them, where we are prioritizing a certain percentage of our highway safety improvement program dollars to pedestrian safety improvements at those intersections. So we have corridors so far chosen in Chattanooga, Memphis, and Nashville, and we are working on selecting corridors for other areas as well. And all of the project designs right now are in design phase. So nothing has gone to construction at this point. So I guess that's all I'll say for that one right now. William, if you want to walk through the tool that we are using to select those corridors and intersections to be funded by the Pedestrian Road Safety Initiative.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Rochelle. And I'll go through the next project and maybe pause after this one and see if anyone has any questions. And we'll talk a little bit more about more recent efforts that we're putting together based on some direction from our new bureau chief, Preston Elliott. I'm sure everyone on the call may be familiar with his background. That's more a systemic approach, looking network-wide and from a holistic point of view. So we're excited about that. So I'll go ahead and dive right into this one, though. So as Rochelle mentioned, this is a multi-criteria evaluation, bringing in different core criteria for purposes of scoring and ranking corridors and intersections. And so I'd like to just kind of go through here and explain each of these, each of the criteria. So first of all, of course, we did conduct a heavy lit review. One of the major reports that we were examining is VDOT, their Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. It's a rather recent plan that they've adopted. And actually, I was just on a webinar yesterday where representatives from VDOT were explaining their process and how there is overlap with their Department of Health and their efforts. And so I do strongly encourage anyone who's interested to take a look at this one. We also looked at some federal highway guidance as well, some bike ped plans, specifically from Alta Planning and Design. It's a private firm that specializes in bike ped projects and whatnot. This one is out of Atlanta. And again, Arizona, of course. Arizona has a really great pedestrian safety action plan. They're in the process of updating right now. I think Kimley Horn's the consultant on that. And just some of the criteria that was used in their statewide pedestrian safety planning efforts were definitely strong influence on some of the criteria we selected. And again, more federal highway. And this is another Alta plan out of Memphis. So just to give you a general idea of what we're looking at, we came up with this. So I'll get right into the criteria. I've got a little visualization here of all the pedestrian-involved crashes over the last 5 years. So we began 2015 to 2019, and so we want to approach this from a twofolded effort. So intersection index and a corridor index. And so most of the criteria you see right here is very similar when looking at intersections and corridors. However, the infrastructure component right here slightly different, just based on some of those the sub criteria that we want to look at. So, for instance, entering vehicles, entering travel lanes, entering speeds, and intersection control type. And so, I will mention that we were heavily reliant on TRIMS. I'm sure some of you have looked into that database. It's Tennessee Roadway Information Management Systems. It's in long-range planning where I'm working. A few of our offices are responsible for maintaining that database, and so we wanted to definitely take advantage of using this with our LRS, our linear reference system, when we're applying crash data and some of these other measures that you're looking at. Equity, excuse me, we were able to come up with an environmental justice index at the block group level, and I'll dive into that. But I think we looked at 8 different population types. Those vulnerable populations could be impacted with these kind of projects. Pedestrian demand, since we don't collect bicycle or pedestrian traffic volume, we want to see where there's more of a higher propensity for walking, more trip generators, trip attractors. So a weighted composite of population density, employment density, mode split, so active commuters, various land uses that would indicate those trip generators, points of interest, and so forth. And so we scored all of our intersections. The corridors will be the same. I'll go to the next table, but basically the same process. We scored everything 5 through 1, and then we were able to weight this criteria accordingly. And so the focus for this particular project, we want to focus more on safety and infrastructure. So these weights are they can be considered subjective, but it can be altered accordingly, with stakeholder input, depending on the MPO or the region. I can't forget about crashes. So we did do a deep dive into Titan database and also TRIMS to look at how we can apply these crashes to our intersections and to our corridors. And so not only do we look at the frequency of these pedestrian involved crashes, but we also want to look at the severity level. So fatality, serious injury, and injury were scored accordingly on the number of those severe level crashes. And of course, not much difference here with our corridor index. So as you can see, most of this is still the same, but our infrastructure, we did want to look at some of those different assets on the roadway, infrastructure assets that we could score accordingly. So ADT, number of travel lanes, speed limits, also pedestrian access, so sidewalks, how many sides they're on the corridor, pedestrian protection, bike lanes as well, and crossing risk. So is it a multi-lane, no median, multi-lane with a median or a center turn lane, or is it just a 2-lane roadway? So just looking at the risk that the pedestrian would have when crossing this particular corridor. You don't see shoulders on here, but again, we're still working through this analysis, and I think we can continue to refine this as time goes.
Does anybody have questions on that tool in particular now?
I just noticed that my screen sharing ended. Is that?
Yeah, I think that accidentally happened. One second, let me see if I can fix that. Caroline, I think that's you sharing. If you could click the little X in the screen in the middle next to the mute button. All right, that should work. We'll try and share your screen again. Let's see if that works.
Okay, one moment.
All right, we can see it again.
Great. And yeah, any questions, please, by all means, go ahead and put anything in the chat, and Rochelle and I can always answer at the end, or just I have no problem if you'd like to ask us along the way. So just for the sake of time, I'll just keep on going through. Just a visualization of the pedestrian involved crashes over the last 5 years, and the legend indicates whether it's a severe or no injury. See if I can zoom in here in 1 second. I just need to move this window. And again, I won't click on each one of these areas, but we do have various attributes that we were examining. So I'll continue to do a further dive in the crash data, but I'm just going to keep on going. Here's the output from our environmental justice index. So we're looking at the block group level. And again, these are those population types that I mentioned earlier, the vulnerable populations. We have a list of them right there. So what we were able to do was basically take a percentage of each of these for each block group, average that, and then normalize those percentages 1 to 5 to create that scale that we found necessary on our scoring process. And so if anyone wants to navigate around, you can kind of just see which block groups are experiencing, or sorry, have population types of interest. I'll just keep going. So next would be our pedestrian demand. And again, this was a weighted composite based on where people live, work, learn, play and shop, access transit. We do have access to, I believe, all MPOs, transit data bus stops, and I think we do even have some for Cookeville. So we wanted to include that as well. And areas that you see in deep purple would suggest a higher demand for that pedestrian activity where those trip generators, as I mentioned before, are located. This was a GIS raster analysis weighted composite, and then we were able to score our intersections and corridors based on that scale of 1 to 5 from low demand to high demand. And again, our infrastructure, this is the corridors. The level of segmentation was quite granular, I will say. We have a variety of linear reference tool sets in ArcGIS where we're able to basically combine all these different, roadway assets. We have different tables and trims, so we can create this a unique segmentation based on what the data states for each corridor. And these are the sub-criteria that I mentioned. Something I should mention is you probably do notice that you do not see any local routes, the functional classified local routes. So we were able to look at minor collector and above, really anything, excuse me, anything where we can collect traffic volume. And so TDOT doesn't collect traffic volume and speed limits, and really some other data sets as well for the majority of local routes. So we were not just looking at state routes, but we're looking at wanted to include as many functional classifications as we could into the analysis. We did, however, exclude interstates and expressways. This is just an output from our intersection index. So I think there are roughly 187,000 intersections included in trims. Just to give you a general idea, we're still going through the process. I'm kind of doing some scrubbing of the data and kind of doing a QA, QC. But as you can see, we have a scale of yellow to red, I think would indicate, 1 to 5. 5 would be the most severe, high risk intersection. So we have this for the whole state. And our corridor index, similar to what you saw with the infrastructure output. However, this is all the weighted criteria together. And so the red would indicate the highest risk. And so we took that 1 through 5 final score and we created percentiles, so 0 through 100. So between 80 and 100, 100th percentile would indicate the highest ranked corridor. So it's definitely a more of a targeted approach. Being able to see where across the state these corridors are highest risk amongst MPOs and rural areas. We did, I like to use Lafayette as an example. I think that's it. So for this particular corridor, it's roughly 2 miles long, speed limit's 30. There is a school speed limit along this route, 15 miles per hour, number of lanes for ADT ranges from 13 to 18,000. Fatalities, let's see, number of crashes over the last 5 years. Pedestrian involved crashes be 28, 4 of which were fatalities, 11 serious, 13 other injury, 2 no injuries. So just kind of give you an idea how you can navigate around your particular area and see this data output And so next steps, we're in the process right now, still going through, but we want to see where the top ranked corridors are located. So top ranked corridors in the 99th percentile. I believe there are roughly 111, I want to say, out of, I don't know the number on the top of my head, but that's the whole state. And so there's a decent representation across the state, rural and urban. You do see more located in Memphis and Nashville, and based on our statistical analysis, we've noticed that most of the pedestrian involved crashes are occurring in these two MPOs. But we're going to take another step from there and narrow this approach even more thoroughly and go from there. And so that's kind of where I was going towards the end. Rochelle can probably touch a little bit more on this, but I think we've changed the number of these corridors. This is just to give you an idea of what our selection process moving forward. So Knoxville was an area and we want to look at Chattanooga, Memphis, and then of course rural, statewide as well. But again, this is not finalized. This selection process is something we're hoping to wrap up since we did just receive word from Federal Highway to move forward. So I think that does it for the Pedestrian Road Safety Initiative. I'm just going to pause maybe for a second before I dive into the systemic approach.
Hey, Will, this is Daniel from GNRC. I wonder if it would be possible for you to throw the link to, somebody just asked in the chat, to that story map into the chat.
Yep, I will do that right now. Let's see.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. So I know we're expecting Dr. Cherry to join us shortly, but and Rochelle, you may be able to touch there. There will be some overlap with our recent efforts with these two projects and what his research plans to conduct. So we can kind of touch on that. But there's no specific questions on this analysis. I'd be happy to move forward with the next one.
Hey, Will, we have one question from Nora from Walk Bike Nashville. She says, what goes into the intersection index?
Yes, so that would be back at the top. Very similar to the corridor. These are the two tables we have here. So the intersection index examines the same core criteria, except for infrastructure. We're looking at entering vehicles, lanes, speeds, and control type. So no control, stop control, or if it's signalized. That's the main difference. But the safety with fatalities, with severity level and with frequency and demand and equity, that all goes into the intersection index. Very, very similar approach. I hope that answered.
Will, we've got one more question. Can you speak to the way weighting factors are chosen?
Right. So that's a great question. We have been experimenting with a more statistical approach to the weighting factors. It can be considered subjective, excuse me, but for this particular analysis, it was the multimodal division and long-range planning division discussing how we should weight criteria and what we want to focus on when examining. I think you could do a scenario approach too. You could equally weight them 25% across the board, and you can do one that's more heavily weighted on equity, demand, and so forth. So we did talk about that, just doing different scenarios, and we this is what we came up with. But again, I always believe in stakeholder input and further conversations, especially if we're looking at that particular MPO. Say if we want to identify high risk areas in Chattanooga, I'd like to speak with the folks that work there to come up with those weightings. And there are statistical approaches to come up with weighting as well. That's something we've just kind of talking about.
Well, that's all the questions in the chat box. So unless anyone else has any other questions, feel free to move on.
Okay, great. So this is a recent effort. Again, systemic pedestrian safety analysis. I'm still kind of learning myself, but it's more of a holistic approach to identify risk factors based on where incidents, pedestrian involved crashes have been occurring, and be able to come up with low cost countermeasures based on this location type. It's there's a lot of great research on this, and so I'm still kind of going through this document. I'll show you right here. This is the NCHRP report 893. It's a great report, and there are a lot of great case studies. I think Seattle DOT, Arizona DOT is in there, and I think Caltrans has a really great process that I'm still reading up on, but it's something I highly recommend. So there's a little bit of background here on looking for those common characteristics, those risk factors, and where these crashes are occurring, and more of a predictive approach where we could see improvements for those particular roadways. So the way I imagine this right now, or the way I'm kind of looking at it, is that we're still in the first 3 steps of this process. So in this document there are 7 steps, and we're in the very early stages. So I did defining the study scope, compiling the data, and of course crash data does take time to go through Titan. I'm going through Titan and TRIMS and kind of looking at if there's any discrepancies. Titan has latitude and longitude attached to all these crashes, but there's a lot of I guess errors in that and where these crashes are occurring. So we have to tie that to our LRS, our linear reference system, in order to identify what the roadway type is where these crashes are occurring, and then run analysis from there. So that is a very challenging approach, but we're still running a deep dive in Titan and TRIMS, and then of course determine those risk factors. So where these crashes are occurring, so we can predict where they're more likely to occur. And so what we have begun with, we've run the analysis for the entire state, looking at severe and serious injuries, but we also wanted to look at some of the higher ranked counties. So we ended up running, I'll show you in a second, crash tree diagrams for 15 counties in the state, as well as statewide, to see if we're missing anything. And just want to note this dark gray boundary that you see right here. This would indicate the urban boundary that we use for functional classification purposes. So that's how we were able to state whether it's urban or rural. I just want to see something. I think that was not okay. That's weird. There we go. That's what I thought. Okay, so the first one's supposed to be, I don't know why Chattanooga popped up there. So yes, so I believe the top 5 you'll see here, it's Shelby County, Davidson, Chattanooga area, I'm sorry, Hamilton, Knox, and the Murfreesboro area, Rutherford. So from what we could tell, just under 2,000 pedestrian involved crashes, 529 which are severe, and so that's when you see these crash trees that we're developing, that's a number that we really want to examine. I'm just going to zoom in for a second and show you. So this is a severe incident, and so we're able to apply this to our LRS and identify whether it is an urban minor arterial. It's a functional route, 2 to 3 lanes. This is 1 fatality, and so you'll see how we can apply this. Speed limit's 35. So just keep on going. Davidson, just go back to Lafayette, of course. Bit of a cluster there. Oops, no, that's not it. Anyway, I've noticed that some jurisdictions do find this very helpful information to have. So just being able to apply the analysis can be the challenge. I'll just get to the crash trees. Another visualization of our Hamilton, 132 severe over the last 5 years, and also 132. And I'm rerunning the crash data, so some of these numbers actually might be a little higher than what you're seeing. So that's just something to note. I think on the first run we had just over 6,000 statewide pedestrian involved crashes, and now it's close to 10 from our most recent analysis. And of course, where MTSU is located, Rutherford County is the next county that we want to examine. But we did, again, look at 15 different counties. So here is the crash tree diagram. So as you can see, starting with this is the total number of pedestrian involved crashes, and then looking at this number, the severe crashes, we wanted to break it down by area type, urban versus rural, location type, so intersection versus non-intersection, and then break it down even further for control type of an intersection and the roadway type or facility type of the non-intersection. In this case, two-way undivided, from what we could tell, the top 5 counties, two-way undivided seems to be the clear winner there. And just looking for patterns and these risk factors that I mentioned before. And I will allude to what we plan to do moving forward. This is, again, draft 1, but this will change a little bit, and this, I think, this will mainly change a little bit. I'll show you our future steps. So, oh, I'm sorry, this was, yeah, this is getting, so Shelby County, I was showing you statewide, but this is Shelby County, 529, and again, nearly 58% are occurring that's two-way undivided. Davidson, similar, just over 50%, and that's 50% of this 424. Hamilton, seeing a pattern here. Knox, they change slightly, but for the most part, most of our pedestrian involved crashes are in urban. That's not a huge surprise, but this is where we really want to focus our energy now. This is Rutherford, and again, I could share this link, but we can. This still is an ongoing process, so it may be tricky to share the data. So statewide, this came up first. This was supposed to be the last one. Something happened there, but I think you're seeing a clear pattern here. And then just to see if there was any difference between the findings based on our severe crashes, we also want to look at all pedestrian involved crashes, and there's not much of a difference, I think. Just looking. Yeah, our control type traffic signal went up a little bit. Our two-way divided went down a little bit for all. But the focus here is severe, and that would be fatality and serious injury. So next steps, now that we've done an initial run of our systemic approach, we do want to add some more criteria in here. And so instead of just looking at two-way undivided, two-way divided, we'd like to break it down a little bit further. Maybe look at 2 to 3 lane, 4 lane divided, 4 lane undivided, 2 3 lane divided undivided, maybe even with a turn lane, without a turn lane, and so forth. Look at traffic volume, posted speed limits, even functional classification. Lane widths is going to be a tricky one. That's going to take a little bit more time in working with our TRIMS data, and transit access. So just some additional criteria to consider. We did have Rochelle and I were on a peer exchange recently with other DOTs and shared this information. They had some really good insight and good input on how they are also conducting systemic pedestrian safety analysis. So I think we've got a lot to learn and still a lot to do with this. I think there's still a lot of opportunity here. And that wraps it up. So let anyone have any questions, and I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you, Will. This is Daniel from GNRC. That was an awesome presentation. We've got one question. You kind of answered it, but Brian says, in addition to the map, will it be possible to download the data? I agree with him. I think it would be very useful for targeting local and regional programs.
Sure. So I was advised by leadership to kind of hold off on the sharing of the data for now. That's not saying we can't in the future. We're in the process of the first draft, especially on the systemic approach, and I'll clarify if that also includes our multi-criteria evaluation for the Pedestrian Road Safety Initiative. I'll speak obviously with Rochelle. She's the lead on this, and our leadership as well. So that's something we have to follow up on. So I wouldn't be able to share that as of today.
Thank you, Will. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, here's one. Joseph says, are you able to get more crash-specific information to identify other important risk factors?
I guess I have to think about that.
Well, I was just going to say, this is Rochelle, that our next presentation will be getting into that very question.
Oh, right, exactly. Thank you, Rochelle. Yeah, our research with UTK, that's absolutely more behavioral aspects and whatnot. So, yeah.
All right. Well, in the interest of time, thank you, Will, and thank you, Rochelle. Dr. Chris Cherry will be our next presenter. Chris, if you're on the line, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Thanks. Yeah, I am on the line. Let's do this. I'll share this screen. Okay. So hopefully you can see my sand dunes. Unlike last time, I promised not to drag up some screen up there. And then I'm going to do this and tell me if you can't see my title page, I guess. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to basically go through something similar or almost identical to the kickoff meeting for this new project that we're starting and with the Tennessee DOT. Okay, and the title of this project, the unofficial title, is Addressing Traffic Safety to Reduce Pedestrian Injuries and Fatalities in Tennessee. It's very simple, and the main objective, of course, is trying to understand what's going on here. So this is from the pedestrian dashboard from the Tennessee Department of Safety, and we've gone from in the pedestrian fatalities in the state in the 60s and 70s, and that was cause enough for concern, all the way up to 150 now. And for all of you online who most are in Nashville area, you've had a year to remember on pedestrian safety. So the big issue, of course, is there's a tremendous amount of speculation about why this is happening. There's a lot of media inquiries about why this is happening, but there hasn't been a tremendous amount of research into digging into these factors that were just alluded to that could include all sorts of things in a transportation system. And a transportation system is, by that I mean the socioeconomics, the behavioral issues that are reflected in transportation safety, the infrastructure, of course, drivers, pedestrians, vehicle types, and the like. Okay, and the important context of this trend here is that this increase in pedestrian fatalities kind of by itself constitutes a huge proportion of the overall increase in overall fatalities in a year in the state of Tennessee. So the state of Tennessee now is 1,100 thereabouts fatalities per year, and this is pushing on 15% of that, getting close to that at least. Okay. And then 2020, looking at the data up year to date on pedestrians, is tracking to to meet or exceed 2019. So that's the other issue, of course, is this problem isn't an anomaly. It's not going away. And the question is, what is it all about? Okay. And so we're going to talk about these 4 things as it relates to this project. And then I have a little postscript, an appendix essentially that looks at some of the bike and scooter related work that we've got going on right now too. This is one project that I'm working on in the context of several projects related to vulnerable road user safety. So I think the audience may be interested in that work. Okay. For the TDOT project, Rochelle is the lead, and then it's myself and my colleague Candace Brakewood, who are on the UT side, and then Hiba Baroud is at Vanderbilt, and she's assisting on some of the decision support part. I've done a lot of work as it relates to safety, vulnerable road users, pedestrians, bicyclists, e-bike riders, scooter riders. That's kind of my wheelhouse. In addition to sustainability, health, and other things. Candace is more of an emerging technology and transit systems person, and she has a very keen interest on kind of the transit connection with pedestrians and how different technologies like transit fare and information technologies influence people's behavior. And of course, that all matters here. And then Hiba is a decision support optimization person researcher who focuses on how we make the best decisions with limited resources when we're trying to optimize a bunch of different things at the same time. Okay, so that's in a nutshell who we are. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop this sort of 4 main objectives, right? Compile a complete picture of pedestrian crashes to the extent possible, as complete as possible, as in the context of these kickoff meetings and other correspondence. We have looked at potentially linking injury data, and we'll get into this in a second. But if that's possible, we would like to do that. And the other big part of this is really understanding how much information we can bring into a database above and beyond Titan data. And that may or may not be possible, it just depends on what we can find, okay? The other part is getting into pedestrian crash types, like a typology approach. We've recently used the PBCAT typology software and framework in order to look at scooter crashes, and I'll show you that in a minute. But by the way, Daniel, how much time do I have here? I'm sorry, I should have said that right off the bat.
You've got about a half an hour left.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, so I just wanted to make sure I didn't gobble up too much time or not use enough. So I'll be less than that, less time than that. I hope to be at least. Okay. So the other objective is to really dig into crash types, risk factors, temporal trends, what's happening over the last decade, and so on. The linking with William, we're hoping to identify these hot spots and hot corridors, looking at this total harm approach, and this is a combination of looking at the severity and the frequency of crashes. Some of the worst roadways don't have a lot of crashes because there's frankly not a lot of pedestrians on them, but when they happen and they're frequent enough, they're very severe, contrasted with maybe a downtown urban environment that might have a lot of crashes but not very severe crashes. Okay, so looking at total harm, which is essentially the product of those two types of analysis. And then management strategies that really focus on more strategic risk-based decision-making. This is a research project to TDOT, so we are going to look at all of the factors that influence pedestrian safety, and then we're going to zero in on the factors that TDOT can specifically approach with their funding strategies or other things, and then finally share results. So the scope is essentially outlined in the objectives that I just went through. There's 5 main tasks. The first, of course, is reviewing literature and trying to understand where the gaps are, what we don't know. We don't want to repeat a bunch of work that others have done. And then the second part is a deep dive of Titan analysis. And if possible, I say if possible, linking injury data from hospitalization records. And one of the main contributions here is with this data, we can actually get into injury data that's potentially a lot better than Titan data. But even if not, a lot of the pedestrian analysis that's happened nationwide, looking at this trend in increases in pedestrian fatalities, is really looking at the FARS fatal data that has a pretty good national data set. The problem with looking at FARS fatal data is you don't see all of the other crashes that are happening that are leading up to these fatal crashes. So the level of analysis you could do is not quite the same. The reason that's important, for example, is if we're looking at large SUVs or pickup trucks, I'll use that example a couple times in this presentation. We want to really understand if that's a factor of just there being more large SUVs or pickup trucks, or if they're inherently more dangerous when the crashes occur. And you look at that by looking at the severity of crashes across all vehicle types. You would expect that large pickup trucks, when they hit pedestrians, result in very severe crashes. So that's something we hope to do. We did an attempt to do this a few years ago, a couple of years ago, as a part of our research center, and had some fits and starts, let's say, trying to think about linking Department of Health and Department of Safety data sets. Okay. The other thing we hope to do is this geographic, what we call a home-based approach, and this is the I think it's a pretty clever innovation. It's not very, it's not whiz bang. It's very applied and so on. And the idea here is that when we think about disease of any disease, for example, coronavirus, we look at where people live and where they're getting these diseases. When we look at injuries and epidemiological approach to traffic crashes, we really should look at what's going on and where the burden of these injuries are falling. Are they falling on poor neighborhoods? Are they falling on neighborhoods that predominantly are white or other, for example? And those are really important ways to think about approaches to safety, approaches to education, approaches, and not only the pedestrians, of course, but also the drivers as well, who are hitting pedestrians. And so I'll show you an example of this as it relates to scooters, but the idea here is with Titan, we can actually kind of transport the crashes from where they occurred on the infrastructure to where the people, the agents in the crash, actually live, and see any sort of equity impacts or any other things. It's really quite interesting when you do that. You can see neighborhoods that have a pretty serious burden of crashes. Okay. We want to dig into the typology. This gets into those tree diagrams that William was presenting earlier, really breaking down crashes into types and types of infrastructure, types of vehicles, types of behaviors, and so on. And then finally, risk-based decision support that I mentioned before. So in terms of reviewing literature, we're going to review the new literature, recent literature, let's say. There's been a good amount of work tackling this problem, but not a lot of answers yet. So we're hoping to build some of that. And then we want to coordinate with existing work. And then we want to basically build off of work that we've done in the past. This is a project with Dio Chimba, who some of y'all online may know from Tennessee State University. This was back in 2014. We finished this report looking at pedestrian and bicycle crash analysis, and the objective of this study was to really give TDOT some direction for their highway safety improvement program funding toward non-motorized road users. So we really were highlighting high crash corridors, high crash intersections, and it's a little less easy. I guess it's a little harder to do then than it is now, because getting back to that linear referencing system and trying to figure out exactly where crashes occurred when not all the records, over time, I guess, when not all records were digital and so on, was tough. And so the newer iteration of the Titan data set from like 2010 onward, it seems to be quite a bit more robust and helps with a lot of this analysis. So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to move forward from that. One of the things that, just to be kind of abundantly clear, is this project is not like Williams in the sense that we're not necessarily getting down to project level analysis and saying this road needs to change or this road doesn't. And that's something I think William and others are looking at from a systemic perspective, systemically looking at types of intersections and then, let's say, specific intersections. But I hope that by coordinating, we can find ways to improve Tennessee DOT's process to actually improve safety through maybe improved design standards, for example, or revised, let's say, speed limit classifications or other things. Okay, so this is that's the other part. The next part, I guess, is really taking a deep dive into these crash data set. This crash data set, that is Titan, and Titan has a really there's a lot of data in Titan. As if you've ever had the fortune to dig into it, you get to know, for example, you can find out the size of the age of the victim and the size of the vehicle that, or the VIN number of the vehicle that was perpetrated that crash, right? And so this is my son, my 7-year-old son, a few weeks ago now, and this is just the new line of truck that's coming down the line. That is the hot new thing, okay? And so there's a lot of speculation and a lot of hand-wringing about these vehicles and pedestrian safety. There hasn't been a tremendous amount of kind of robust research that really digs into the level of risk associated with these vehicles, for example. Hypothesis I could think of when we're studying this is if the fleet of vehicles on the roadway is trending toward this, then what is the safe speed limit for a roadway then? Is it 25 or maybe it's 20, right? Or maybe it's less. If the pedestrian that gets hit by this at 15 has the same negative outcome as a pedestrian getting hit by a car at 25 or 30, then maybe Tennessee DOT or others needs to think about their speed limits if they're going to not do anything to inhibit the growth of this sector of the fleet. So those are all things that we can start thinking about, and certainly one of the things I really hope to get out of this call, and hopefully I intend to leave some time at the end, is get some feedback from you all who are kind of frontline trying to figure out these problems. Okay. If we can, we'll link data. The Department of Health and Knox County TPO, Knoxville TPO, I should say, did do some pretty heavy linkage approaches with pedestrian safety. I found this out talking to Ellen and one of the Department of Health folks, Daniel Brewer, Brian Brewer, one of them. Sorry, Crumpler, not Brewer. I think it's William Brewer online. Geez, I'm getting everybody mixed up. This is the risk when you have telecons and all you do is see people's names, but you don't see their faces, right? The point being is that we're going to hopefully dig into this. We're hopefully going to identify what level of underreporting there is in the health data. If that's kind of a turnkey process, it may not be that easy. Okay. The next is this home-based approach, and again, linking home address to crashes, and then we can draw pretty good demographics from the census. If you know anything about crash data, you know that you have very limited demographic data from the user, from the victims of the crash. You know where they live, you know their age, you know their gender, you know their race, but you don't know things about the neighborhood, using the data from where they live, you can go back to see what the demographics of that neighborhood are. And that's really important to try to understand. For example, are these people getting hit on the way to the bus stop, or are they getting hit when they've arrived downtown from their suburban home location or something like that? Okay, so it's really useful to do this, and it's also really useful to understand where people are being injured relative to their house and the demographics of their neighborhoods. We just published a paper in TRR journal last week, or it just came out last week, that looks at what we call the comprehensive crash cost of neighborhoods, and basically apply all the crash cost of a neighborhood evenly to the neighbors. So the idea here is, well, the takeaway message, one of the kind of tweet-worthy moments is that poor neighborhoods bear disproportionately high crash cost on average, in part because they live next to high-volume roads and high-speed roads, I should say. That's one side, and then when you apply the sort of income denominator, you find that as a proportion of their total income, it's a huge percentage compared to higher income neighborhoods. Okay, so it's kind of a double whammy against poor neighborhoods in that case. So you can do that kind of analysis with pedestrian safety. The next is to apply this PBCAT work, this crash typology, look at infrastructure, vehicle types, behaviors, other trends, and dig deep into that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the context of scooters in a second. Are there certain behaviors that may have changed? When you think about crashes more than doubling, fatal crashes more than doubling, certainly infrastructure is part of it, right? But it can't really be all of it because we haven't changed our infrastructure that much in 10 years, right? So there's behavioral issues, there's vehicle fleet issues, there's all sorts of things that could be compounding onto this. Have behaviors changed that much? Probably not. Of drivers, of pedestrians, it's really difficult to tell what all these things could be, but we really want to dig into all of them through this PBCAT typology work and really focus on the next part, which is decision making. So if we do find, let's say hypothetically, for sake of discussion here, we find that almost all of or some large proportion of crashes are right turn on red related crashes. That may be something that Tennessee DOT might have some influence either explicitly or implicitly as it relates to operations of signals, even though I know Tennessee DOT doesn't like to deal with signal systems. That could be an option, or maybe different types of alignments at intersections or whatever else that could improve that outcome. Okay, and so this is where we get this multi-criteria decision analysis. I use the speed limit example. If all of our vehicles are getting bigger, then maybe safe speeds are getting slower, and the like. Okay, we'll look on that. We'll look at that with TDOT staff, do some sensitivity analysis to make sure that whatever decision process that comes out of this is kind of robust to individual kind of, let's just say individual biases or preferences or anything else. It should just be it should be as an objective as possible decision process. Okay. And then we'll have final reports, recommendations, and this is an 18-month project. So we're just getting into the task ones, literature review, background, digging into the data, and so on. So let me just, I'm going to skip past my question section, and I'm just going to give you a quick analog here with bike and scooter safety data. This is a project we've been working on. It's kind of work in progress still, but we were able to extract the bike and scooter safety data out of Nashville. These are crashes that are reported in Titan, and from there we can actually measure hot spots, hot corridors for bike and pedestrian safety. One of the big questions for us is, are bicyclists and scooter riders in the same class of kind of behaviors and safety, or are bike and scooter safety patterns drastically different? You will notice that there's a lot of scooter crashes downtown, scooter crash hotspot. And of course, that's because there's a lot of scooters downtown. You'll also notice, for example, that we have these kind of heat map lines here, or not heat map, but basically like, yeah, I guess the heat map on the corridors. The purple lines are the number of trips along those corridors are proportional to the number of trips. So you can see which corridors downtown have the most scooter trips. This is from the scooter data that Nashville has been collecting and sharing with us, thank goodness. And unfortunately, I've been learning that the city is given in to the demands of scooter operators and is not collecting any scooter data anymore, from what I understand. So this is a one-off study. We can't track this into the future in terms of where crashes are relative to where people are riding scooters, okay? Or we can't weight it by exposure. We rely on this Titan police crash data. There is this cool pedestrians on an electric scooter person type. I really hope that that gets consistently reported, because then we'll be able to grab that data directly and with less reliance on the narratives. And then we'll be able to do a lot of analysis of questions like this. So for example, we can do something like this related to pedestrians, but in this case, we looked at 79 bicycle crashes, 51 scooter crashes. We did the same time period, same approximately geographic bounds, and we reviewed the full crash narratives. And important to note, of course, none of all these crashes, none of the drivers or passengers in cars were injured. So really focusing on the vulnerability of these road users. But then hopefully you can see this. We're talking about how we can break down the different categories. And this is, of course, only 50, or I should say 130 crashes between the two modes. But you can see some big differences between scooter riders and bicycle riders. Scooter riders are younger by a decade or so than bicycle riders. Scooter riders are struck in daylight or dark lighted conditions, meaning street lighted conditions, whereas cyclists are also struck in daylight or more dark unlighted conditions, so dark roads, okay? And then gender, there's more women struck on scooters than on e-bikes, or than on bicycles rather. If I've said e-bikes, that's a slip. I should be saying bicycles, okay? All right, and then this is the kind of cool trick. Oops, sorry, I don't know what happened to my slide there. This is a cool trick with that home-based approach, right? Is you have this this rider distance from home and driver distance from home. So for bicyclists, most of our bicyclists are struck between 1 and 2 miles, between 0 and 2 miles from home. You see those first two big bars there. And you might say, surprisingly, that over a quarter of e-scooter riders are struck within a mile from home. So these are downtown dwellers who are living in urban Knoxville or Vanderbilt or around, and are using this thing from home, not the narrative that these are all wacky tourists who are drunk on Broadway, right? They might be drunk on Broadway, but they might be locals, okay? But if you look over to the right, you see this maybe 1/3 of users are from outside of town. They're 50 miles or more away, which is kind of an official definition of a traveler. And so you can see that that's a big part of the scooter story, not so much of the bicycle story. On the driver distance from home, you notice almost nobody lives downtown or in the kind of urban core relative to where scooters are struck or bicyclists. Whereas most of the folks that strike a bicyclist or a scooter are in this 10 to 50 mile range, the suburbanites, right? And so very few, of course, are from farther outside. A few more in scooters, but probably not statistically significant. So these are not necessarily tourists. They're like people that live outside the city and drive in. Okay. So that's part of the story that we can kind of dissect with PBCAT and others, okay? And then intersections, this is when you get into the infrastructure part. Intersections are super important. 80% of bicycle and scooter crashes in our small study here, our small downtown urban Nashville study, are at intersections. About 25% of scooter crashes are right turn, right approach, which means essentially that a scooter is arriving from the driver's right. Most of the time they're on sidewalk coming in from the driver's right. So bicyclists, you know, this is a big risk if you ever ride on the sidewalk when you're riding the opposite of prevailing traffic, that cars coming from driveways or from intersections are turning right or not looking for you, okay? The other time, so this is a lot higher than bicyclists is the point. This is a big increase from those of bicycle crashes, which bicyclist crashes have more right hook crashes and left turn conflicts where the cars fail to yield to a through bicyclist. And so those are the types of findings that we found on this, and we're going to emulate some of the same work for pedestrians as we move forward into the next step of this project. So with that, I'll back up to slide 13, which is questions and hopefully some discussion as well. So get out of this slideshow so I can see what's going on with chat. All right. Any questions? Who's going to MC this thing? Dan, is that you?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, either put them in the chat box or you can unmute yourself and say them out loud.
Chris, this is Nora at Walk Bike Nashville, and I was just curious with the small sample size of data for scooters, if you compared your findings with, with findings in other cities or states that are doing similar work, or is it just Nashville specific?
Yeah, it's just Nashville specific, and to our knowledge, there hasn't been other cities who've really been able to get into the details of specific crashes. There's only been a couple of studies that we've seen that have been more than like an epidemiological study about like how many people broke their ankles versus their wrists versus their heads, let's say. So yeah, we haven't. There hasn't been a lot out there as it relates to actual infrastructure and behavioral crash causation type of studies. And unfortunately, because it's a small sample, and this is a problem whenever you do detailed crash analysis versus like bigger data analysis, is you can't run like a multivariate analysis, meaning you can't like control for 20 things at once if you only have 50 crashes. You can only do these cross-sectional analyses that you say women are more than men, but you don't know what kind of strength that has in like a regression. So yeah, the point being is there's a lot to do, and it's a good first cut, I think. And unfortunately, there's plenty of crashes, but there's, boy, how do I say this? There's not enough to do any really deep, statistically rigorous multivariate analysis. Yeah.
Chris, we've got a few questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Can you see them?
Yeah, I am. So let's see. Hopefully, I'm not missing. I'm trying to scroll up. The question was this question directed to me? Will you be providing data to be downloaded by the public? And by that you mean crash data? Probably not. So first of all, the crash data is a lot of it's personally identifiable one way or another. So you got to be careful with that. There's a lot of detailed use parameters, but the Department of Safety, for example, puts out a lot of crash data that's not identifiable, and that would be the place to get that. Our analysis will be available to the public. The analysis I just showed you, for example, is kind of aggregated analysis, and we're not pointing out individual crashes very much. So I think that that's going to be kind of published publicly in reports and in journal articles and other things. We have in academia, we have institutional review board, human subjects protection stuff that we get to help protect the subjects of our research, and in this case, crash victims or people who we have to go through this process when dealing with any data set that has identifiable information. Does that answer the question, Brian?
Just quickly, I don't know if William, not to put you on the spot or anything, because I know we haven't really talked about this, but is there anything you can preview in terms of how this would be incorporated into what TDOT makes publicly available, or are we way too early to even talk about that?
Yeah, I think we're still in the early stages to provide anything, and Dr. Cherry made some really good points about it being personally identifiable. So, yeah, I'm not comfortable yet, I guess you could say.
There's some nice. I'm trying to remember. Maybe they're down. Who knows? But for a while, there was some pretty detailed maps online on Department of Safety website where you could dig in. That was along the lines of what William was presenting.
And then that is correct, Dr. Cherry. I can actually put in the link for some of the dashboards and maps that Department of Safety has created, and they are available. So I'll go ahead and put that in.
Does the crash data take into consideration construction projects, temporary situations such as sidewalks, bike lanes, shoulders, closures, etc.? So the narratives have a lot of this information, and then there's this uniform crash coding manual and Titan zone crash fields that are included in the police crash reports. One of the things that was nice about Nashville relative to statewide analysis is that we have basically two police departments that deal with scooters. Rather, it's Nashville Metro and then Vanderbilt PD, and so that's to the extent you have consistency in reporting and training and so on for reporting these, that's nice. Knoxville, for example, has Knoxville kind of lousy reporting of police crashes, of scooter crashes that have occurred, the ones I've found. And so those are all part of the story. But there are, I think construction zone is a tab there, but it doesn't have any details on the nature of that unless it's written into the crash narrative or drawn into the crash diagram. So that's when when we get to the point where we're going through like thousands of these instead of hundreds, we start to lose some efficiency there. Okay. We have written a nice little script that can run through and text mine a lot of the narratives, so that we basically go through all of the PDFs that we can download and pull out the ones that say things like scooter or probably maybe construction, pedestrian, that sort of thing. Okay. Let's see. Going down the list, Marty, you asked, are you able to tell what scooter or bike crashes are not vehicle or infrastructure related, as it relates to scooter and crash injuries caused strictly by user error? Yeah. Again, this gets down to the narrative. Almost every crash that we saw had that we read, and you get into reading these narratives because, or at least I do as a curious researcher, and you see kind of these like multiple compounding factors within the narrative that resulted in the crash. And so it's really hard to put yourself in the mind of a scooter rider. One of the ones that I thought was interesting was a family was riding scooters on sidewalk against traffic, wrong way. And they were on a one-way busy street. So the intuition would say, well, they should have gotten on the street and gone around the block 3 ways to go where they needed to go, with a young child who should not have been riding a scooter. What ended up happening is a car just ran over, just basically ran right through one of the riders. Okay, and and nobody was injured, thank goodness. But the point is that the officer who reported it reported like 5 things that the scooter riders did wrong, but didn't mentioned in passing, let's say, that the driver, who ended up being a hit and run driver, turned across a group of scooter riders and hit one of them going into a side street, and so there's all these different errors and other things that happen, and the trick is to make sure that we understand to what extent those errors should be forgiven on the roadway without being hit by a car, right? What else do we have here, huh? Anybody else? Feel free to shout it out. I like hearing voices too.
Sorry, did you answer Bill McCord's question?
About
yes, you did. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we'll and then let me see. Phil, I see you have a question here. Oh yeah, e-scooter safety once again. Okay, so we're there. The other thing, speaking of docked e-scooter pilot, this is like one of those confounding things. There's is it perception or reality that undocked scooters are safer or less safe, or more, you blur the lines between safety and aesthetics and clutter and perception of hazards and so on, and ADA and access and the whole thing. So all of that we're unfortunately not probably going to see a lot of data on injuries from pedestrians and scooters. That's one of the problems with relying only on Titan, and that's why you need to get a Department of Health injury data, unless it involves a motor vehicle, we're not going to see it. And so that whole part of sidewalk clutter and pedestrian risk and trip hazards and everything else is kind of unfortunately a non-transportation related risk in the eyes of NHTSA and Department of Safety. That would be great to get into the injury data to see that. And that's one of the benefits of these epidemiology studies that dig into hospitalization and emergency department data. Okay. All right, I think that's all I see. Anybody else? Oh yeah, Will posted the story map. Turn it over to you, Dan.
Great, thank you, Chris. That was an awesome presentation. I know I've seen it before, but I think it's really great that and important that you're taking really a holistic approach and looking at the human element of pedestrian safety, because I think in a lot of pedestrian safety analyses, the human element gets lost. So really appreciate that. And I think
just on that note, I do hope that obviously this is just a kickoff, like ideas that or frame of reference and frame of research that we're doing, and hopefully in short order we'll have some results we can share with the group here.
Right, and that's where I think at least on an MPO level, it's going to be really helpful for all of us on the call who are working on a regional level, is seeing how we can use this research to improve our projects and better tackle pedestrian safety, which I can only speak from Nashville's standpoint, but it has been a year to remember, and we really do not need to be focusing on anything but Vision Zero when it comes to pedestrian safety. So I really appreciate all the work that you guys are doing at UT, and then I appreciate Rochelle and Will attending the call and presenting as well.
All right, great.
All right, so I know we're running a little bit late, but Nora, if you want to quickly go through your pedestrian safety updates, what you guys are working on at Walk Bike, and how some of us can plug in the Nashville area.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to give a condensed version. So yeah, Daniel asked me just to give a quick update on our work, and I will share my screen. Nope. Let's see. How do I do that?
Chris, if you could stop sharing yours, I think then it'll give Nora. Perfect.
Does that work?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, so we've been really focusing on Vision Zero in Nashville for a couple of years, and we have been focusing on it and framing it in that way because we think that's kind of the comprehensive, multidisciplinary and top-down approach that we really would like to see. And I guess I'll just highlight a couple of the things we've been working on, and I would say overall our work is focusing on building political buy-in into this and building kind of like the will to make a difference. And less on the data side, because I think we're all seeing the data is really pointing towards this problem. And it's a question of how do we build the political will to do something about it. So most of the state has seen, I know Memphis as well is particularly bad. We've seen a really dramatic increase in pedestrian fatalities in the last decade. We're at 28 for the year in Nashville, which is above where we were last year at this time. And last year was the worst year ever in the history of the city. So that we also are seeing the percentage of total fatalities that are pedestrians just rising. We're over 30% and continuing to go up year over year. And there's been work on this, and I won't get into this too much because it's been kind of referenced before, but the city started to look at this in 2014 when the trend started going up, and there was a pilot bicycle pedestrian safety study that the city public works department prepared. And you can see it identified some of the hotspots that later appear in some of the presentations earlier. But what our concern with this was really came up in 2018. And the fact that, we had a report in 2014, and then in 4 years, almost nothing happened. And a number of people continued to die at the exact locations that were identified. So between 2014 and 2018, of the 50 locations that were identified by the city, only 4 had seen any improvement. And as a result, there were 82 people killed at those 50 locations, 257 injured. And the trend, as you saw, continued to get a lot worse. So this really highlighted to us that we need to figure out how do we kind of create that action and the political will, because identifying the locations is only a first step. We did also do some work looking at key characteristics of those crashes, which were discussed earlier, mostly on those larger undivided state highways. So, and 83% of them were on state routes, but in that time period, which certainly reinforces, I think, what a lot of TDOT's been finding and working on recently. So that's exciting. And then one other big overlap we saw in Nashville was just the overlap with transit routes. So these purple lines are the top 5 transit corridors in Nashville, and you can see they overlap almost perfectly with our top crash corridors. This is just a quick shot of what those streets look like. I know there are a lot of streets like this across the state and a lot in Nashville. This one is Murfreesboro Pike, which is one of the top crash corridors. But I think it ranges between 5 and 7 lanes. There's missing sidewalks on most of it. There's very few crosswalks, pretty poor lighting, and a lot of people who need to get around on foot. So in 2018, we did have a petition that was signed by half of Metro Council and the Mayor Cooper when he was a council member. And we just kind of outlined 5 things we wanted to see. We wanted to see the city commit to a goal of eliminating traffic fatalities. We wanted the city to create a Vision Zero action plan to really prioritize and identify strategies to turn the tide around. We wanted to see a pedestrian safety program, and most importantly, to staff. Our Metro Public Works Department has fewer staff now than they did in 2008. So their capacity to really address this proactively is really hampered by that. And then we wanted to see annual updates, and then funding, obviously, is a big part of it, that we would love to see come out of the capital spending plan to really make immediate improvements. So how do we kind of get there? So we've taken a couple kind of key tactics, one of which is humanizing the victims. We feel like the voices of people who are killed are usually lost in these conversations. So we started hosting an annual memorial every January or February to just honor the names of everybody who was killed the year before. And that's proven to be a really powerful event. This was the one in 2019 in the beginning of the year. And related to that, we have just formed a chapter of Nashville Families for Safe Streets, which kind of connects and advocates for the families and friends of people who've lost loved ones or who've suffered severe injuries themselves. And again, we just want to make sure that these voices are sometimes the most powerful. And we've seen in New York City and other cities, the voice of someone who's lost a brother or a mother or a father or a daughter is sometimes more powerful than all the stats in the world. So this did get off to a little bit of a tough start. We launched it in February of this year. So, it's tough to connect to people, but we're really excited about the future of this program. Throughout, we've also done a lot of political education, and I've spoken about this before and with many of you, but we know we want to get local and state elected officials on board and understanding these issues. And so the more we can kind of build relationships with them, the better that's going to be. Similarly, we do a lot of work around media, and so we have a communications and advocacy director. Last year, we had over 75 stories about pedestrian crashes, which is important in just raising the awareness of the general public, which is important if you want money for these sorts of things. But lately, we've also really been focusing on the quality of the coverage and trying to educate reporters about blame and who they are blaming in their language. Because, whoops, can you guys still see? Yeah. So often we see media reports, even without intentionally doing so, they place the blame on the pedestrian, and that can really influence how the public views these types of crashes. So that's been something we've been focusing on more recently, and I can talk more about it if people have questions. We've done walk audits at hotspots, which continues to be a good way to get the agencies involved. And then I think as a result of a lot of our attention on this issue, including in particular during our most recent mayoral election in February, back when gathering in small spaces was permittable, we had our memorial for the 2019 crash victims. And Mayor Cooper, who was at that time pretty recently elected, joined us and committed to making it a priority for his administration. And all those people behind him are Metro Council members. So we're really excited about that. The city of Nashville is now is about to start a Vision Zero action plan. There's an RFP out to select a firm, so we think that work will be starting any day now. And we're really excited to have some kind of political commitment to it. The mayor's just released a transportation plan draft as well, and safety is really featured front and center in that. So we're excited about the kind of focus that the city is now placing on safety. And then now just running through a couple of things we have ongoing. One, we have been doing a webinar series about Vision Zero to prepare for the action plan. We have a Vanderbilt intern who's doing a report on the 2019 pedestrian crashes and also about the media coverage and how their language places blame. We are doing an intensive community engagement project on Murfreesboro in Nashville. So we've hired someone specifically just to do outreach and engagement on that corridor. And that's also part of our kind of focus on diversifying the voices. We want to make sure more people are part of these conversations, particularly since we know that people of color and people of lower income are much more likely to be victims, and we don't see them usually at the table. So we want to change that. Related to that, we've also been doing a lot of work around systemic racism and how past decisions around land use, around redlining, around transportation investments have now played out to influence a lot of these challenges. And then last, obviously Nashville is out of money and there's a potential property tax referendum to take away the money we have. So in the short term, we'll be focusing on helping the city continue to have funding for kind of the key priorities. So with that was kind of a whirlwind because I know we're out of time, but I will stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how to do that. There we go.
This is Rochelle. Just real quick, unless something's changed, I think that the Murfreesboro Pike community engagement work with that Brenda's helping you all lead up with, I'm so excited about, was funded by one of the MPO's active transportation program grants.
Yeah.
So just full circle back to this group, which of course scores those projects.
Yes, thank you for highlighting that. Yeah, we were really fortunate to get that funding through WeGo, but originally from an MPO active transportation grant. And I think it'll really benefit the ability to get community input on all projects on that corridor, either by the state or by the city. Yeah, any other questions or thoughts?
All right, thank you, Nora, so much. Sorry we're running so late today. Appreciate you, everyone who was presenting, giving their presentations. I think that this is a pretty timely group of pedestrian safety presentations, seeing as last month was a really, really bad month, especially on Dickerson Pike. So with that, I will go ahead and close the meeting. Nashville MPO BPAC members, look for a follow-up email for next month's meeting. I know that the last Wednesday of the month falls pretty close to Thanksgiving, so we'll be looking to reschedule probably earlier in the month and look for an update on our regional transportation plan. All right, thank you everyone, and stay safe.